for joining us on FutureTV. I'm Linda Tamim, and these are today's headlines. Parliament fails to discuss the wage hike draft law after Speaker Nabih Berri sent back the bill to the joint parliamentary committees for discussion over differences on the race. Prime Minister Tamam Islam affirms that the Lebanese state is following up on negotiations regarding the possible release of the kidnapped soldiers and policemen. And U.S.-led forces carry out at least 5 airstrikes against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in a Syrian Kurdish town. Parliament has failed to discuss the wage hike draft law after Speaker Nabih Berri sent back the bill to the joint parliamentary committees for discussion over differences on the raise. Finance Minister Ali Hassan Khalil said the salary raise was postponed after military personnel were excluded from the wage hike. Defense Minister Samir Muqbil said he will propose a bill to the government on a wage hike for the army after the military corps expressed reservations to the controversial pay raise draft law for the public sector. Berri had earlier warned he will withdraw the draft law from the agenda of the parliamentary session if certain parties continue to oppose the bill. His warning came as private school teachers rallied near the parliament to protest their exclusion from the salary hike. The referral of the hike back to the joint committees was seen as a victory for the protesting teachers, but it is likely to infuriate private sector teachers who had been asking for the raise for years. The head of the Private School Teachers Association, Naame Mahfoud, had called for an open strike and the rally. During the rally, Mahfoud told reporters at Riyadh Solah Square that the failure to give the private school teachers their rights was aimed at causing divisions among the members of the SCC, which is a coalition of private and public school teachers and public sector employees. Prime Minister Tamam Islam has affirmed that the Lebanese state was following up on negotiations regarding the possible release of the kidnapped soldiers and policemen. Salam, speaking in Najm Square, stressed that the matter was not a mere political commodity. He implored the Lebanese to cleave to their national identity. The Prime Minister went on to assert that his meetings with the families of the kidnapped military men were ongoing. He said the state fully sponsors the kidnapped military men and their families and refuses to sponsor terrorism. We aim to cooperate as Lebanese citizens in order to preserve national unity. The Maronite Bishops' Council has rejected necessary legislation at Parliament in light of the ongoing vacuum in the presidency. The Maronite bishops reiterated pleas to rival officials to adhere to the Constitution and elect a new president, saying that there is nothing more urgent than the presidential poll. The bishops expressed solidarity with the families of captive soldiers and policemen held by Islamist militants, urging Muslim authorities to take a bold stance against extremist movements sweeping the Middle East. They also expressed deep concern over the spread of anti-Christian extremist slogans in Tripoli, North Lebanon, which they warned would jeopardize civil peace and coexistence. The clerics hailed the Spiritual Islamic Summit, which recently held at Dar al-Fatwa, during which a joint Christian-Muslim committee was established to deal with problems facing Christians in the region. They also raised the alarm over the proliferation of drug trafficking and prostitution, underscoring the urgent need to take moral measures to fight the trend. The brother of a journalist kidnapped 6 days ago by a gang in East Lebanon has been released through a deal brokered by General Security. Media reports say the abductors released Khudud Darwish, the brother of an LBCI reporter, without any ransom being paid. The gang had initially demanded $135,000 in return for Darwish's release after luring him into the village of Taibe in the Baalbek area. Armed men have kidnapped a Lebanese national on the outskirts of Arsal. Media reports say the abductee was buying stones from a stone crusher plant in the Wadi Hamid region. Voice of Lebanon Radio identified him as Maher El Amaturi, who hails from the Shuf district of Barouk. U.S.-led forces have carried out at least 5 airstrikes against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant outside Kobani, after the group's fighters pushed to within 2 kilometers of Syrian Kurdish town. Today's strikes hit Aizil front south and southeast of the town, also known as Ain al-Arab, which the group has been battling to take for more than 2 weeks. ISIL had continued closing in on the town near the Turkish border, despite multiple U.S. airstrikes on Tuesday, as the U.S. Defense Department cautioned it cannot bomb the militants into obscurity. U.S. warplanes had also bombed ISIL targets in neighboring Iraq on Tuesday, as Kurdish forces launched attacks on 3 fronts in a bid to recapture ground lost to the group last month. ISIL fighters have captured large parts of Iraq and Syria, declaring an Islamic caliphate that has not been widely recognized and committing a wide range of atrocities. Syrian Kurdish refugees continue to cross into neighboring Turkey as U.S.-led forces launched airstrikes on Islamic State fighters who have besieged the Kurdish town of Kobani near the Turkish border. 138,000 Syrians have made their journey to the Turkish border since Friday, including Hanin, who came on foot, carrying her child the entire distance, even though she is 8 months pregnant. Take a look.
One by one they came. Some carried into safety, others carrying whatever they could. Desperation and fear etched on their faces as they fled from the advance of ISIS troops. Whole families made the journey to this border. Hanin came on foot with 16 of her relatives. She carried her child the entire distance, even though she is 8 months pregnant.
الكل خايفين كل ما يجي صوت كل واحد ينفرش على اساس بدنا ننيم الاولاد ما عاد يحسنوا يناموا ولا شيء كله خوف الخوف من شو كلنا طلعنا من البيت من القصف مشان هيك.
And this influx shows no signs of abating as ISIS forces push further into the nearby village of Ain al-Arab.
At the moment, it's the 3rd day, and we have observed like over 138,000 people coming into the Turkish border, looking for every type of need. It's the biggest influx that Turkey have seen so far. The needs are urgent, needs are so big. Most of them are women and children. We are trying to do as much as we can, coordinating with the officials here, but it's really not enough. The numbers are too huge. Turkey was already, hosting over 1.5 million. With the recent influx, it's over 1.6 million already.
Those that crossed spoke of an exodus. When Arif heard the bombs last night, he gathered all his family and followed the long trail to the border.
كل قرية يخلي محله يجي على القرية تاني ويجي من ورانا تاني يجي على القرية تاني يجي كل هالمطرح 6 أيام ولا حدا مطل من المطرح.
Those that arrive here will be taken to nearby transit centres and vacated public buildings. They will be given a place to sleep, regular meals and basic relief items. But for how long, no one can predict.
In Syria, 17 people, including 10 children, have been killed in twin explosions near a school in the central city of Homs. Another 56 were wounded. The explosions took place as children were leaving school at the end of classes in a neighborhood dominated by minority Alawites, a Shiite offshoot sect. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights reported the same toll and added the toll could rise as body parts were still being collected from the scene and several of the wounded were in serious condition. The Syrian official says it was the deadliest strike to hit the government-controlled area in months. Coming up next, the first case of Ebola is diagnosed in the United States. That and more after the break. Welcome back. Residents in southern Baghdad were assessing the damage after a car bomb exploded in their neighborhood the night before, killing 2 people and injuring 8. The attack in the southern neighborhood of Zafaraniya was one of a wave of car bombings and other attacks on Tuesday, targeting Shiite majority areas of Iraq. Officials say at least 47 people were killed, including more than 20 in the capital. No one claimed responsibility for the attacks. Thousands of protesters have thronged the streets of Hong Kong, ratcheting up pressure on the pro-Beijing government that has called the demonstrations illegal and vowing to press ahead with their biggest protest so far. As Hong Kong observed National Day, marking the 65th anniversary of the founding of Communist China, protesters continued to occupy the central business district, and movement leaders said they will announce plans to escalate civil disobedience. China is facing growing U.S. pressure to show restraint during the mass pro-democracy protests. A day after the United States backed calls by thousands of protesters for greater autonomy in selecting candidates for Hong Kong's chief executive, U.S. officials said U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry will discuss the issue with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi when the two meet in Washington today.
I don't have very much new to say from yesterday in terms of our view. We're obviously continuing to watch this closely. If you'd like me to repeat anything, I'm happy to. In terms of the second question, we believe the legitimacy of the chief executive would be greatly enhanced if the Basic Law's ultimate aim of selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage is fulfilled. And if the election provided the people and provides the people of Hong Kong a genuine choice of candidates representatives of the voters' will. And certainly this is, we've consistently voiced our support for that, including directly to China.
Are you going to, do you expect the Secretary to do that in his meeting with his Chinese counterpart tomorrow?
Well, there are certainly a range of issues on bilateral, regional, and global issues that they'll discuss during their meeting. We certainly expect they'll discuss current issues, I should say, where this is obviously a prominent issue in the news, one the Secretary is well aware of, and I expect it will be a part of this discussion tomorrow.
And you would expect that he'll raise it?
We'll see how the conversation goes, but I think it's certainly something that could be on the agenda.
Two suicide attackers have targeted military buses in the Afghan capital, Kabul, killing at least 7 people just a day after the new government signed a security pact with the United States. At least 15 people were wounded in that attack. The Taliban claimed responsibility via Twitter. The death toll from Japan's volcanic eruption rose to 48, the worst in 88 years, after more victims were discovered on the ash-covered summit. Military researchers resumed a recovery operation with helicopters early this morning, a day after officials called off rescue efforts because of poisonous gas and fears of another blast. Moving on to the United States, a patient being treated at a Dallas hospital has tested positive for Ebola, the first case of the disease to be diagnosed in the United States. Federal health officials say the unidentified patient is being kept in isolation and that the hospital is following Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommendations to keep doctors, staff, and patients safe. The patient is a Liberian national who was reportedly admitted on Sunday. The hospital had announced a day earlier that the patient's symptoms and recent travel indicated a case of Ebola, the virus that has killed more than 3,000 people across West Africa and infected a handful of Americans who have traveled to the region. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. Parliament fails to discuss the wage hike draft law after Speaker Nabih Berri sent back the bill to the joint parliamentary committees for discussion over differences on the raise. Prime Minister Tamam Slam affirms that the Lebanese state is following up on negotiations regarding the possible release of the kidnapped soldiers and policemen. And U.S.-led forces carried out at least 5 airstrikes against the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant in the Syrian Kurdish town. Those are today's headlines from us here at Future Television. I'm Lina Tamim, wishing you all a very pleasant evening.